Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Nick Reed. I work for my company, Reed Mobility. With previous employers, I've led many trials of different types of connected and automated vehicle, and a lot of my projects now relate to the safety and indeed ethics of automated vehicles. I also have a role with National Highways as their Chief Road Safety Advisor. So I'm going to talk about a safe, ethical, and responsible transition towards connected and automated mobility. And today I'm going to be talking about two things to remember from today: ethical goal functions and digital commentary driving. And I'll explain what those things are. So I think about automated vehicles at the moment. We talk about the Gartner hype cycle and being in the trough of disillusionment. I think we're in the, I think we can talk about Schrodinger's CAV. I think connected and automated vehicles, the industry is both alive and dead at the same time. We've got the evidence of Argo shutting down. At the same time, companies are actually delivering this. They are actually providing a service with vehicles that have no driver on public roads. Admittedly, within tight constraints, but these services exist. Those constraints will broaden over time, and services like this will emerge. So talking about the work, these ethical goal functions and digital commentary driving, a lot of it stems from work that I did for the European Commission on CAV ethics. And we had 3 different categories of recommendations that we produced of the 20. 6 related to safety, 9 related to transparency, and 5 related to responsibility. And I worked primarily on the safety recommendations, given my background. I'm going to talk about a few of the rules, the recommendations that we proposed in that process. So the first one is similar to what Jessica was talking about. How do we determine when it's appropriate for automated vehicles perhaps not to comply with the rules of the road? So the rules of the road are there for human drivers to guide their safe driving behavior and to achieve coherence, to achieve consistency between drivers, understanding from both drivers and other road users of how vehicles might behave. How should a connected and automated vehicle manage this? It doesn't have a human brain, a human understanding of society to determine when it's appropriate to potentially non-comply with a rule, as one of the examples Jessica gave, in order to promote safe driving. So we talked about maybe changing the rules, as Jessica's described, with the infinite variety, the infinite complexity that we might encounter in the road environment. It's very difficult to describe all of the rules explicitly that an automated vehicle should follow in order to operate safely. Should you hand control back to a human within the vehicle or maybe in a remote location? You've got all the issues of the transition of control. Will the human understand what to do in a short space of time, depending on whether they're in the vehicle or even remotely? Or do you allow the connected and automated vehicle not to comply with the rule, but then it must offer some sort of evidence to suggest why it chose to break that rule in that particular instance? So those were the things we discussed. And kind of in that context, following on from the recommendations, several of the authors and myself wrote a paper about how we would address this. And we talked about the need for these ethical goal functions, that we don't think it's possible for an automated vehicle, for the AI system that underpins that vehicle, to learn everything about what it might encounter in the driving environment. Given that infinite complexity, it cannot experience all of the different conditions it might encounter. And even if it could, even if you could get an enormous data set, it wouldn't derive the human values that underpin how we expect automated vehicles to behave. So what we suggested is needed is an ethical goal function, which is an attempt to capture what society expects automated vehicles to do. And we use those, the automated vehicle developers would use those to guide the behavior of their vehicles once deployed. Now, we're not saying that those should be set in stone and forgotten forever. They are something that would evolve over time. They could be different in different locations. So the French ethical goal functions might have different flavors to the ones for the UK, or the ones for Japan, or the ones for India. And it wouldn't end up with all manufacturers operating their vehicles in exactly the same way. There would be opportunities for different manufacturers to adopt different driving behaviors, more sporty, more comfort-related, provided they stayed within this ethical framework. And as Jessica suggested, we were proposing that this should have what we describe as a democratic legitimacy. There should be a role for the public in deciding how the vehicle should operate. Now, that might include saying, we don't want them at all. We don't, in this particular environment, we don't want automated vehicles to be operating. And I think that would be a fair conclusion for some types of operation. But if they are going to operate, these are the sorts of boundary conditions we expect them to do. And that should include the perspectives both of the users and non-users, pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists, and so on. So two other recommendations I'm going to mention, that they should reduce physical harm and redress inequalities and vulnerability. These relate to the idea we need to understand the impact, the effect on risk the introduction of connected and automated vehicles would have. I think it's fair to, I think everyone would agree the introduction of these vehicles should result in a reduction in harm. It should. It would be unethical if they were introduced and increase harm. But in the European Commission work, we said there should be no increase in harm for any category of road user. So even if car occupants' injuries and fatalities were massively reduced, if there was an increase in risk for cyclists or for pedestrians, that would be seen as unethical. And that no other benefits could compensate for any increased risk of harm. So if you had reduced congestion or increased access to mobility through the use of automated vehicles, it would still be unethical if there was an increase in harm. But in order to understand this risk picture, we need data in how they operate, in the impacts these vehicles have on the communities affected by their introduction. And then lastly, we tried not to spend too much time on this, but trolley problems. Now, I know the topic, and people talk about ethics in automated vehicles, it is a subject that comes up. But we talked about dilemmas, and I think there are genuine dilemma situations that we need to understand how automated vehicles will behave. Now, how we tackled this with the expert group, dilemmas represent one moment in time, but what we want to understand is what were all the behaviors that led up to that dilemma situation. If the vehicle behaved safely and ethically in everything it did up to the point of that dilemma, then that's okay. And then everything it does afterwards, can we say that all the things it did represented a safe and ethical approach to the dilemma it encountered? So that's how we framed these trolley problems, thinking much more about driving as a continuous process, a continuous balancing of risks. And by only observing that continuous process, can you say that they're operating safely and ethically? So all of these things depend fundamentally on data. I think that needs to be accurate, it needs to be standardized, it needs to be comprehensive, it needs to be shared. It needs to be a fair representation, a realistic representation of how vehicles behave, and that enables us to see that they're behaving appropriately. So in order to achieve that, coming to the second part is this, we came up with this idea and work for the British Standards Institution, BSI, of this idea of digital commentary driving. Now, this is an idea that all AV developers would be required to share a subset of the data that their vehicles are collecting. It should be sharing a standardized form of what can the vehicle see, how was it predicting that the hazards it was perceiving are moving, and how did it choose to act in response. Because all vehicles will need to have that information held within their processing, there's not IP. We think there's no IP conflict in there. So that data can exist outside of this IP bubble, as we described, and can be shared with a regulator to say, these are how our vehicles are behaving. We think they're seeing all the hazards they need to see. They're responding in the way they need to respond. All is good. If that's not the case, then a regulator can take decisions about when and where it's appropriate for these automated vehicles to operate. Now, there's a lot to learn in how we might collect this data, how we might analyze this data, but I think having that understanding of how the vehicles operate from a data-led perspective will mean that we can say they are definitely operating in a way that is considered safe and ethical. And I think it's going to be a key element to ensure the public recognises the potential safety benefits that these vehicles can bring. That was, so what we need that industry standard on how we collect data to show safe and ethical operation. The protocols for how that is shared, with whom it is shared, how these regulatory bodies might analyse that data, what they then do with it, the protocols for that data sharing. Clarity over the ethical goals, so how are we expecting these vehicles to operate, and societal engagement in how we define those ethical goals. How do we gather what people are expecting in the way these vehicles should be deployed and how they should behave, and can we confirm that they do indeed do that when they are deployed? Now, I've been fortunate to win some funding from the Rhys Jeffreys Road Fund, which is doing this process. I'm trying to collect information from the public on how to determine the ethical goals, and we'll be reaching our conclusions in the early part of next year. I'm really looking forward to that process and getting the feedback from people, understanding what they want from automated vehicles, if they want them at all. So that's my presentation for today. Really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.